If you have ever stood at a Walmart checkout long enough to actually look at what is stacked by the register, you have probably seen a Gerber knife. $7.95. Shrink wrapped to a cardboard backer next to the gum and the phone chargers, one of a dozen impulse buys nobody plans to make. It would be reasonable to assume that is what Gerber has always been. That assumption skips over 1968, and the soldiers of Vietnam's most secretive special operations units issued a government knife and choosing to carry a Gerber instead, upside down on a flight vest, because it is better than what the army gives them. The company did not get cheap by accident. It got cheap on purpose in 1987 when a Finnish scissors manufacturer bought it and started making different decisions about what the name was for. This is a knife guy story. To understand how a knife that soldiers chose over their own government's gear ends up on a rack by the register, you'd have to go back to 1939 to a man in Portland, Oregon who has never designed a knife in his life. Joseph Gerber runs an advertising agency, a family business his father started in 1910. He is not a cutler, he is not an outdoorsman by trade. What he is, every December, is a man who wants a better Christmas gift for his clients than a bottle of something or a calendar. In 1939, he asks a local knife maker named David Murphy to build 24 sets of kitchen carving knives. Murphy makes them from salvaged steel, ground off old hacksaw blades, fitted to handles by hand. Gerber mails them out. His clients like them enough to mention them to other people. One of those other people works for Abercrombie & Fitch. The New York retailer sees the knives, likes what it sees, and asks Gerber for enough sets to sell in its catalog. An advertising man with 24 Christmas gifts has just become a knife manufacturer. He names the company Gerber Legendary Blades, and because the word legendary is already sitting there in the name, he leans into it. His sons carry the idea forward. The knives get names lifted from myth. Balmung, after the sword that kills a dragon in Norse legend. Excalibur for the blade a lake hands to a king. These are kitchen knives, sold by mail, named like weapons out of an epic. Nobody involved seems to think this is strange. By 1947, Gerber has moved from kitchen cutlery into the field. The company licenses a hunting knife design from Thomas Lamb, an American industrial designer, and it debuts in that same Abercrombie & Fitch catalog that started everything. Joseph's sons take over the running of the company. As he steps back, Francis Ham Gerber first, then his brother Joseph Pete Gerber Jr. a few years later. Neither brother trained as a knife maker either. What they inherit is an advertising man's instinct for what makes an object worth wanting, applied to steel instead of print. Under their direction, the mail-order gift business becomes a proper dealer network, carried in sporting goods stores and hardware counters across the country, still selling knives named for swords out of legend to customers who have never read the sagas those swords came from. The business grows the way a well-run family manufacturer grows in post-war America, steadily, on reputation, one good product at a time. In 1966, Gerber outgrows its original space and moves into a new factory in Teagard, on the edge of Portland. The company still operates out of that same building today, close to 60 years later. At the time it goes up, it is simply a bigger home for a knife company that has spent 27 years building kitchen blades and hunting knives named after legends. That same year, the United States is escalating a war in Southeast Asia, and the army is looking for a fighting knife. Gerber is about to find out what its name sounds like when it is not attached to a carving set. Gerber brings in Bud Holtzman, a retired army captain, to design it. Holtzman does not start from a hunting knife or a kitchen blade. He starts from a museum piece, the Mainz Gladius, a 2,000-year-old Roman short sword, pulled from the Rhine and studied for the way its blade tapers to hold both weight and balance in a short weapon meant for close work. Holtzman builds a prototype around that geometry, tests it, revises it, and hands Gerber a design unlike anything the company has made before. The first models ship in 1967. The blade is 6.5 inches, double-edged, spear-pointed, narrowing sharply at the waist before flaring back out toward the guard, a silhouette collectors later call wasp-waisted. The handle is cast aluminum, not wood, not bone. The whole knife runs 12 3/4 inches and weighs 8 ounces. It comes with a sheath built to be worn upside down, blade toward the ground, strapped to a flight vest or a chest rig so it can be drawn upward in a single motion without looking down to find it. Gerber calls it the Mark II. Pick one up. even now. The handle is not wrapped or checkered the way a hunting knife handle usually is. It is smooth cast aluminum, cold in the hand, built for a fast draw rather than a comfortable grip. Because comfort was never the requirement. The blade tapers in at the waist and flares back out toward the point, a shape that puts more steel exactly where a stabbing weapon needs it and less everywhere else. The same logic a Roman legionary's armor worked out 2,000 years earlier without a materials lab or a blueprint. The sheath rides upside down on purpose. Draw a knife the ordinary way, point up, and the motion telegraphs itself before the blade clears the sheath. Draw it point down, and the same motion that pulls it free is already most of the way to a strike. None of this is decoration. Every design choice on the Mark II answers a question about how fast a hand can move in the dark. It is not the most common knife in Vietnam. That distinction belongs to the Ka-Bar, standard issue for a generation of Marines. The Mark II earns something narrower and, in its own way, harder to earn. It becomes the knife special operations soldiers choose for themselves. The men of Mac V SOG, the covert reconnaissance and strike teams running missions the government will not officially acknowledge for another 20 years, are issued government equipment. A meaningful number of them buy a Mark II with their own money and carry that instead, because they trust it more. Stories about the knife circulate the way stories about combat gear circulate, soldier to soldier, mostly unrecorded. A few survive in print. A Blade magazine field editor recalls a helicopter crew shot down and pinned, fighting through with rifles until the ammunition runs out and the Mark I eyes come out next, the crew holding on until air support and a rescue helicopter arrive. A knife maker in the same industry recounts a story told to him over dinner by a Medal of Honor recipient, of a team overrun and a Mark II drawn in the close fighting that followed. These are not government records. They are the kind of stories a knife earns when the people who carried it keep telling them decades later, which is its own kind of evidence. By the early 1970s, the knife has acquired a reputation sharp enough to make the people who run military base exchanges nervous. Some post exchanges quietly stop stocking it, the internal reasoning being that a knife shaped explicitly for killing at close range is, in the words used at the time, not in good taste for retail display, even on a military base, even to the soldiers who might be issued into combat with one. It is a strange kind of compliment. The knife is too honest about what it does to sell comfortably next to the toothpaste. In 1979, Al Marr, a Gerber designer who will later found his own knife company, adds sawtooth serrations to the spine, and Gerber renames it the Mark II survival knife. The redesign has less to do with survival than with the PX exchanges again. A survival knife can go back on base shelves in a way a fighting dagger cannot. The object does not change much, the label around it does because the label is what determines whether a store will carry it. The Mark II runs in production through 2000, returns for a limited batch in 2002, comes back in full in 2008, and stays in the catalog until 2022. Across those years, it turns up in places that have nothing to do with the jungle it was built for. Mel Gibson carries one as Max in The Road Warrior. It appears in the cafeteria brawl in Aliens, in a knife fight at the climax of Under Siege, in a close quarters fight scene in Captain America: The Winter Soldier, decades after Vietnam ends. A design built by a retired army captain off a 2,000-year-old Roman pattern becomes, without anyone at Gerber planning it, one of the most recognizable knife silhouettes in American film. For most of that run, it carries the entire weight of the Gerber name among people who actually know knives. In 1987, the company that built that reputation is still privately held, still headquartered in the T-Guard factory it built in 1966, 48 years removed from an advertising man mailing Christmas gifts to his clients. That is the year Fiskars buys it. Fiskars traces back far earlier than any knife company reaching into an adjacent category could explain. It is founded in 1649 when a man named Peter Thorwaldsted is granted permission by the Swedish crown, which rules Finland at the time, to forge iron in a village called Fiskars. 338 years separate that permit from the purchase of Gerber. Fiskars is best known to most Americans who could not place Finland on a map for a pair of orange-handled scissors sitting in a kitchen drawer somewhere in nearly every house in the country. It is a company built on volume, on consumer goods manufactured at scale, on the kind of design for the masses thinking that put those orange scissors on shelves worldwide. Fiskars built its modern reputation on a genuinely clever piece of design. In 1967, a Fiskars industrial designer named Olaf Backstrom replaces the heavy forged iron scissors tailors had used for generations with a lighter version, plastic-handled, curved, to fit the hand, made from leftover orange plastic originally meant for kitchen juicers. The color is decided by an internal vote. It becomes one of the best-selling consumer products in Finnish history, more than 1 billion pairs sold worldwide. The kind of design so ubiquitous that most people who own a pair have never once wondered who made it or why it is orange. In 1987, Fiskars is a fraction of the size it will eventually become. A Nordic manufacturer known mainly for that pair of scissors, a company with a national reputation in Finland, and a modest international footprint. Buying an American outdoor knife brand is at the time a reasonable expansion move for a company already comfortable selling sharp things to households. Nobody involved has any particular reason to think of it as the beginning of anything larger than that. Gerber's ownership does not change again after this. Fiskars owns the company in 1987 and still owns it today, uninterrupted, the longest and only corporate parent the Gerber name has ever had. The acquisition itself is not a dramatic story. There is no boardroom standoff on record, no last stand by a founding family refusing to sell. What is on record is simpler and, in its own way, more revealing. A 48-year-old American knife company, built around one legendary combat blade and a catalog of hunting knives, becomes one division inside a 338-year-old Nordic manufacturer whose flagship product is a pair of scissors. The name on the blade does not change. Everything behind it does. What changes first shows up on the paperwork, long before it shows up in the steel. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Fiskars begins moving portions of Gerber's manufacturing overseas. First to Taiwan for certain product lines, later increasingly to China for the budget tier of the catalog. This is standard practice for a consumer goods conglomerate managing margins across a global portfolio. And it happens across the knife industry during these decades, not to Gerber alone. What makes it visible to Gerber's own customers is the T-Guard factory sitting right there, still running, still stamping some knives with an Oregon origin, while other knives carrying the identical Shield logo are stamped with a country on the other side of the world. Long-time owners notice. On collector forums through the 2000s and 2010s, people who grew up trusting the name start comparing notes. A Gerber bought new that falls apart under normal use. A blade that arrives with a bent tang, a recall notice for a product that would have been unthinkable from the company that built the Mark II. Some point out, not without frustration, that a company selling knives for $7 and $8 at a big box store is competing on a price point the old Gerber never touched, and that the quality follows the price point down. Others still buy the American-made line and defend it. The Applegate Fairbairn folder built in T-Guard on a design descended from the same fighting knife lineage as the Mark II, or the Guardian, a boot knife designed by the knife maker Bob Loveless. Both groups are describing the same brand, and in a real sense, two different objects. There is something worth sitting with here. A brand name promises nothing on its own about what is inside the box. It is a label attached to whatever a specific factory, under a specific set of instructions, decided to build that year. The same 3 letters, the same shield stamped into the same spot on the handle, can mean a knife forged to a standard that survives a war, and a knife assembled to hit an $8 shelf price with as little steel and as few hours of labor as the specification allows. The customer holding the box at the register has no way to know, from the name alone, which decision made the knife in their hand. That gap between what a name promises and what a specific factory actually delivers is the principle that governs everything that follows. It is worth saying plainly what this is not. Gerber does not stop making good knives. The T-Guard factory keeps running, and a real portion of the catalog is still built there to a standard that soldiers, hunters, and collectors continue to trust. What starts deliberately is something else. 2 very different products under one name, sold at the same time, with the market left to sort out which one a given customer meets first. For a growing share of customers, especially the ones meeting the brand for the first time at a Walmart or a gas station rather than through a gun shop or an army surplus store, the thing they meet first is the cheap one. The gap the principle describes shows up, over the following 2 decades, in the plainest way a consumer product can show it, in federal recall notices. In 2007, the Consumer Product Safety Commission recalls roughly 154,000 Gerber EAB pocket knives. The locking mechanism can let the blade slide past its support during use. Gerber receives 8 reports of lacerations, several requiring stitches. The knife retails for about $11 and is sold at retail stores nationwide, including Walmart. It is manufactured in China. In 2012, a smaller recall follows. About 3,000 Gerber instant knives, a spring-assisted model, pulled because the locking mechanism can fail and fold the blade during use. That same year, a Bear Grylls branded Gerber machete is recalled for a laceration hazard of its own. In 2015, the largest of these recalls arrives, about 150,000 Gerber cohort folding knives in the United States, plus another 11,000 in Canada, after 6 reports of laceration injuries. That same year, a separate federal matter closes, a $2.6 million settlement over the Gerber Gator Combo Axe, a knife and hatchet combination tool designed in 2003, manufactured in Taiwan and sold at Dick's Sporting Goods and Bass Pro Shops for as much as $60 before its 2011 recall. Gerber had voluntarily reported the defect to federal regulators years earlier. The dispute over the timing of that report, not the defect itself, is what takes until 2015 to resolve. This is not a single bad batch from a single bad year. It is a pattern spanning nearly a decade across several different products concentrated specifically in the overseas manufactured mass retail tier of the catalog, the same tier a customer is most likely to encounter at the checkout register, rather than in a specialty shop. 4 separate federal recalls, 3 of them tied to a locking mechanism failing under exactly the kind of ordinary use a folding knife is supposed to withstand. Without comment, none of this touches the Mark II. None of it touches the American-made line still coming out of T-Guard. The knives failing are the knives built to hit a price point low enough to sit in an impulse buy rack, and they are failing in the specific way cheap manufacturing tends to fail. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but reliably, one recall notice at a time, over years. Gerber's own public statement on one of these matters, issued after a related federal settlement, describes the company's conviction in its product quality and reliability as strong enough to make the decision to settle a difficult one. The knives being recalled do not agree. The recalls do not end the relationship between Fiskars and Gerber. There is no reason they should. A handful of federal notices involving an $11 pocket knife is not the kind of event that moves a conglomerate to divest a division, and Fiskars does not divest it. Instead, over the following decade, Fiskars keeps growing and Gerber keeps shrinking in relative size, next to what is being added around it. In 2015, Fiskars pays $437 million to acquire WWRD, a British and Irish luxury goods group holding Waterford Crystal, Wedgwood China, and Royal Doulton, brands with 2 and 3 centuries of their own heritage behind them. Before that acquisition, Fiskars describes its own key international brands as Fiskars, Ayatollah, and Gerber. 3 names, one of them a Portland knife company. After it, Gerber is one brand among many inside a company whose defining new direction is fine tableware. By the 2020s, Gerber sits inside a portfolio that makes its own case, without a single word of commentary needed. Fiskars organizes its holdings into segments. One segment, called Vita, holds the company's luxury design brands: Waterford Crystal, Wedgwood China, Royal Copenhagen Porcelain, the Danish silversmith Georg Jensen, the Finnish glassware house Ayatollah. Fine tableware, sold to people furnishing a home they intend to keep for decades. Gerber sits elsewhere in a segment called Terra, alongside the Fiskars brand's own gardening tools, and Gilmore, a maker of garden hoses. A knife once carried into close combat by men who trusted it with their lives, now shares a corporate division with watering cans. The scale around it is not small. Fiskars Group reports roughly 1.1 billion euros in net sales for 2023, close to 7,000 employees, operations in more than 100 countries. Gerber is one line item inside that structure, a knife brand sitting next to hedge trimmers, reporting up through a Finnish conglomerate whose most recognizable product to most Americans remains a pair of orange-handled scissors. The T-Guard factory has not closed. It runs around the clock, and the company still manufactures a genuine slice of its catalog there, roughly 139 products, carrying a Made in USA mark. Steel sourced domestically, sold alongside a much larger volume of knives made overseas under the identical logo. Gerber still supplies knives and multi-tools to American military and law enforcement buyers. The Vietnam-era reputation was not a lie, and it has not entirely disappeared. It has simply been outweighed on volume by the tier of the business built to hit a shelf price at a store that also sells groceries. A short drive from Teagard in Oregon City, another knife company took a different path. Benchmade, founded decades after Gerber, stayed privately held, stayed premium, and never sold to a conglomerate looking to add a knife brand to a portfolio of hoses and hedge trimmers. Nothing about Oregon required Gerber's split into two tiers under one name. A different set of owners a few miles away, making a different set of decisions, arrived at a different outcome. The geography was never the variable that mattered. One clarification is worth making plainly, because the confusion is common. Gerber Legendary Blades has no corporate relationship whatsoever to Gerber, the baby food company. Same surname. Two entirely unconnected businesses. An accident of naming that has confused two generations of shoppers, standing in two very different aisles. What is left in the end is a single shield logo covering two different manufacturing standards and two different price points, owned by a company whose largest product categories have nothing to do with knives at all. The Mark II still exists in the catalog's memory in the collector market in a handful of American-made models built in the same factory that built it. It exists next to a $7 folder, shrink-wrapped to a cardboard backer, made on the other side of the world, sold to a customer who has never heard of MacV-SOG and does not need to. Go back to that Walmart checkout for a moment. The one with the Gerber knives stacked next to the gum and the phone chargers. $7.95, one of a dozen impulse buys nobody plans to make. In the 1970s, American military base exchanges quietly pulled the Mark II from their own shelves, deciding a knife this honest about what it was built to do was not fit for casual retail display, even to soldiers. 50 years later, a knife carrying the same shield logo sits in the most casual retail display in the country, at the register, between the candy and the chargers, and nobody pulls it. That is not really a story about a knife getting worse. It is a story about what happens to a name once the factory behind it stops being the only factory behind it, once a 370-year-old scissors company decides what a legendary blade is for. The knife in your hand at the checkout is real. It works mostly for what it costs. It is just not the knife the men in the jungle chose over what their own government gave them. That knife still exists. It is just not the one by the register.